You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Demaris. We're both lifelong hunters, deer biologists, professors of wildlife management, and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. We explain the latest research, including our own work and that conducted elsewhere.
So if you're interested in deer biology and management, this is your podcast. Every decision you make is a step in your management program, and we give you the knowledge to make every decision count.
Welcome back, everyone, to Deer University, where myself, Steve Demaris,
And I'm Bronson Strickland.
we try to take science and help you apply it to your properties and to your understanding of life. And today we're talking about pine management, and we have a specialist here, the Extension Forestry Specialist, Brady Self at Mississippi State University. Welcome, Brady.
Hi, Steve. I'm glad to be here.
We're happy that you are. And Brady, we have a lot of listeners that are either private landowners themselves and perhaps have management options that they face. And we also have a lot of listeners that lease forestry land for hunting right opportunities. And so a lot of people, and really in the Southeast, we're the wood basket of the world now, or the U.S. for sure. And so forestry is a big deal. And a lot of times we don't always understand the terms that we hear passing around. So could you start us off with just kind of a description of a pine stand and how it, and do we want to say differentiate natural pine stand from a planted pine, and what's the life of that like, the rotation?
Sure. Of course, you're looking at two completely different systems there when you go from a natural stand to an artificial stand. Everything from genetics to just our cultural treatments that we're going to be involved with in those different types of management. When you look at I guess for sake of where we're going with this, when you look at natural stands, you're thinking about a cheaper option. That's where most of our work was done historically. We didn't plant trees, so to speak, and it's still a viable option. You still see it used some, especially in the governmental type settings where you're on the refuges and on some of the national forests, as well as a little bit of private industry that I know that does that type of work. But you're using a seed source that's already there. It's already on site, and you're using that seed source to basically provide the regeneration that you're moving forward with in the future for management purposes. One of the negative aspects of that type of work is the fact that you don't have any control over density, so to speak. Whatever nature gives you is what you're going to be dealing with, and you'll get into situations with I'm the herbicide guy for our group. I'm kind of a forest herbicide guy, and you get into situations where you can have 250,000 baby pine germinates to the acre in some of the samples that we've done. And of course, it doesn't stick around that long. However, it's absolutely inside the realm of possibility to have 10, 12, 15,000 pine trees to the acre at age 10 in some of those situations where you hear dog hair pine stands, and you get lower, reduced growth rates out of those stands. You also have problems with, disease and fire damage if a fire happens to get in there and things like that, and just slower overall growth. So from an economic standpoint, without intervention into those stands, you don't expect to have the type of growth that we really look for in forestry out of those stands. Now, the other side of the coin there is cheap. It doesn't cost you anything for that regeneration and that establishment, but you don't have the ability to really push that stand along like you could by using some of the quote unquote improved genetics that are available in the forestry world, in the pine stock that's available out there. As far as management goes in those stands, obviously you're going to get your seed on the ground, and you get into the stem exclusion stage where they're starting to fight it out, and the trees are duking it out amongst themselves, and you start getting a lot of natural mortality. So at that point, in order to try to push that rotation along, now they'll do it on their own. Trees will do it on their own. They will sort it out eventually, but it takes a lot longer. So in order to try to push that rotation, meaning seed to log truck, to push that rotation and try to shorten it down, because time is money, what winds up happening is you go in and do things like pre-commercial thinning, which you wouldn't have to do in a plantation type setting. So, there's a trade-off in there as far as, not having to do one treatment and having to do one treatment in natural versus artificial regeneration. But once you start doing that pre-commercial thinning, pre-calming, if you want to call it that, moving forward, you'll wind up doing some type of a thinning operation. Typically, it's going to be a little bit later because you're still going to have more trees. Typically going to be a little bit later than it would be in an artificial setting. However, you're probably looking in that 18, 20-year range versus maybe a 15-year-old stand in a artificially regenerated stand. And at that point, once you do that thinning type work, at some point down the road, you come back and do a final harvest. Now, if you flip that back over to talking about artificial regeneration, a lot of your treatments are still the same, but you have an improved stock. I don't know, at least in the loblolly world, I don't know of any unimproved stock that's out there, meaning unimproved genetically speaking. You can still get some basic, first generation type seedlings, but I don't know of any woods run seedlings that are available anymore. So what that does is every time you get a generational change, so everyone's probably heard of first gen, second gen, third gen, some of those generational improvements that have been done to trees through crossbreeding, you get about a 10% bump for each generation. Okay, there's also, and that's volumetric growth, not necessarily in qualitative, but volumetric growth, so quantitative. Once you move over into some of the other stocks like MCPs, which is mass control pollinated, and varietals, which are, for lack of better terminology, it's a clone, where you move into some of those planting stocks, you pick up even more. So by the time, from a volume standpoint, you get into varietals, you're looking at seedlings that are capable of 50 to 60% more volumetric growth than you had in your traditional wood run seedlings. So you have a faster growing tree. You also have a much more expensive seedling that you're putting in the ground, and you reduce your density. You're trying to get that rotation still being short, but trying to get that tree big fast, or at least that's where we went from a traditional standpoint in pine silviculture. And as far as spacings and densities, if you go back not that far in the past, we were still recommending planting on 8x8s and 9x9s, 8 feet between, or 7. I've seen some 7x8 spacings and things like that, where we were trying to cram a lot of seedlings in on a per acre basis because you expected to lose 40 or 50% of them due to natural mortality. Well, when you're planting and spending all the money that it takes to plant those seedlings, that you're having to spend, in some cases, a lot of money on once you move up into those upper planting stocks, when you're going through that process, you don't want to lose those seedlings. So you're also doing other herbicidal work, you're doing cultural work, site prep type stuff. You plant lower numbers of those seedlings to be able to afford to pay for that. So you're into the world now where depending on what you're planting and where you're planting it, you're seeing recommendations for spacings down into sometimes as low as 400 trees to the acre. 450 trees to the acre. You're seeing those old, just standard densities that were, approaching 800, 700 to 800, all the way down into the 400 to 500 range now. So yes, your seedlings cost more, but you're planting fewer of them. And then while you're planting, you're going to do site prep in forestry. We've kind of moved away in pine forestry. You've kind of moved away from the mechanical treatments. They're still there. Some people still do them, but it costs a heck of a lot of money to go out and shear, pile, rake, and burn a site. You're talking $250, $300 to the acre.
It'd be like with heavy-duty bulldozers and deep plows.
Shear blades on D7 dozers, that kind of thing, and then ripping and everything else that goes along with it. And you're looking at a very, very expensive process. So we moved primarily over into the chemical world in that point. So we're doing chemical site preparation now.
When you say site preparation, You want to just clarify?
Sure. Basically, you are creating a seed bed and a site that's suitable to grow pine trees without competition. That's what we're looking at, vegetative competition. And in that world, you don't expect to get a site totally scalp clean. It's not the nuclear option where you see little green trees and brown vegetation. You're talking about getting 90% of your vegetation controlled. That's a good number. We're happy if we get that. But when 20 years ago, you could count on spending $100, $125 to the acre, 90 being on the low end for some of those site prep treatments. Some of the treatments that we spec'd out last year from different forestry consultants that I talked with and helped establish, herbicide treatments that they're putting out. You can, in some cases, get down into the $55, $60 an acre range, which at that rate, why not do it, right? It's very affordable. And that gives you, all the literature that's out there, all of our experience is you wind up with a much better survival rate. You wind up with a much better growth rate. Primarily growth is actually where the research shows the biggest impact in that type of world, but the survival's there too. Can't get a tree to grow if it doesn't survive, right?
Right.
So the world hadn't changed a lot other than we have a lot of products now that we used to not have. Move forward in time, you can get into release operations, all that. I don't know that we really want to, delve into that. If your site prep failed, you may have to do a release operation, whether it's herbaceous or woody. You get, into the mid-rotation range, so we're talking, rule of thumb, you may go as early as 12 years, but that's incredibly rare. Not that you can't have trees that are biologically in need of removal of in a thinning operation, but financially you can't do it. You're just not able to get a logger in to work that type of material over. So 15 years, 16 years is where we would like to see those stands thinned. But the reality of it is our pine markets are so bad now that there's a world of stands out there that are 18 years and 20 years and 22 years old that are finally being thinned for the first time. And I don't have exact numbers off the top of my head, but I can tell you there's not that long ago, a multi-decadal surplus of first thin pine material at current consumption on the ground. So we're talking 40 and 50 years of surplus pine wood in plantation settings that needed cutting. And that just ain't gonna happen.
Are you saying this is 30 to 40 years into the future, or we've been in it for 30 to 40 years?
No, into the future. On the stump right now, we're looking at multi-decades worth of material that needs to be thinned. And that's not that's going to take that long to work it through. That's the supply that's on the stump right now. At one point, it was just over 50 years in the north half of the state. It's lower than that now because it moves back and forth, and you get outgrowth into the larger product classes and things like that. But
and Brady, there's
a lot of wood out there.
There's a lot of wood out there. Is that just a bottleneck on the user end of it? We're not using as much wood product, or the bottleneck, the getting it out and making the products from it?
Both. It's kind of a perfect storm type situation. How many letters do you send now?
Not many.
A lot of email, right? How many newspapers do you read?
But I do get a lot of boxes every day from Amazon.
That's where I'm going with that. Our consumption of paper has gone down. Everything's electronic now, and the need for pulp has just decreased. Now you touched on corrugated cardboard, corrugated paper for Amazon and things like that. That's one of the big two. Really, when you start talking about our end use for pulp now. You know what the other one is?
Toilet paper, paper towels?
Yeah, you're close. You're in that region, but you're not there yet. Steve's a little closer than you.
I'm just shaking my head.
Diapers.
Oh.
Diapers.
I didn't do it, Steve, and nor did I set them up either. That was completely organic.
Why am I closer I'm further away from diapers.
Paper fluff. for diapers.
Oh, you're talking about
grandkids
old
now.
age.
Yeah.
Oh, you're talking about me being old enough I needed that.
Well, I know that, but I was trying to give you the benefit of the doubt and say you got a grandson now.
Yeah,
No,
my
you
grandson
take it
needs
either
diapers.
way you want, but reduced mortality in seniors is that our largest growing demographic in the nation is centenarians, but even below that, the expectation is for our group, our age group is you're probably going to, at least you or your wife will live into your 90s now. And it is what it is. We all get old at some point, and Bronson, you may need them too. But
Stuff
at
just
some
stops
point,
working.
At some point, stuff starts working, and incontinence hit, right? But that's one of the two really biggest end uses or increasing end uses in paper.
Wow.
And so we're growing trees to provide diapers for Steve here, but
Let's not make that the soundbite for today, okay?
But I mean there are other uses, and we still use paper and all that. That's fair, but our usage in those categories has gone way down, and until we develop an end use outside of that for pulp, you can kind of almost expect for it to continue to decrease. Or at least that's what the economic people tell me. And we just have so much wood on the stump. It's just there's a lot of the mills have shut down. We're working on a logging force that, according to John Owl, our logging specialist, I believe he said 45% of what we were in the late 90s. Lots of wood on the stump, few mills, not as many loggers. It's hard to even get your wood thinned if you get right down to it. It can happen, but if you're into lower acreages or pulpwood that doesn't have some larger stuff in it too, you're probably going to have some difficulty in getting it harvested, getting somebody to work through it. Which from my standpoint as a forester, it's not the kiss of death. You'll hear that a lot of times, but it's definitely the kiss on the economic side, where you're losing a lot of growth. You're extending out your rotation. You're having to carry that money longer, and even once you get it to the stage, which is the next stage, which is final harvest, you run into some issues with vastly reduced value at that point. If you, I used to work for the Corps of Engineers back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and I personally sold timber. Now, you can look at their timber, their pine timber, and you've been around the lakes. It was planted in the 1950s and 1960s, probably even into the 70s, some of it, in the YLT program, Yazoo Little Tallahatchie River, Little Tallahatchie project. And they've thinned it here and there, but when I first started there, that's what I thought timber looked like. No, I had a rude awakening when I moved away from the Corps, but they still have that same timber. It's just bigger now than it was 20, 25 years ago when I was working there. And timber that I was selling or marking for a sale, I guess I should say, in the late 90s, early 2000s, that they were getting $58, $60, $62 a ton for. A couple of years ago, the last time I talked with one of their foresters, they were getting $12 to $14 a ton for.
Night.
And they're junk budding. They're leaving 18 feet, 20 feet off the bottom of that log on site because it's too big. We don't want to actually haul it to a mill anymore.
Is that what you meant, Brady, when you said losing value? Was it just that it's sitting there too long and you're paying taxes on it, or is it just that the tree's gotten too big?
Well, I mean, rate of return. You get into the financials, and I'm not the guy to talk about that. But absolutely true. And reduction in market value, the cost of money over time. And then you're also paying taxes, which, things like some of your world over here with leasing and things like that, you can offset some of that. But all in all, it's not as good of a financial decision as it used to be. It's still there, it still pays. Yeah. You're not going to get an economist to tell you what they guesstimate the rate of return, but off record, and since we're on a recording, I won't give the number. Off record, they'll tell you, and it's still positive. It's still a positive number, but it's not the 30 and 35% that people were used to in the 90s and even early 2000s. It's way, way less than that now. And
when you say 30 or 35% rate of return, relative to what?
What do you mean?
Well, that's what I want you to, use that terminology for listeners. What do you mean by 30 to
at one point, you could expect us, 30 to 35% interest rate, extra money at the time you finished up. If you look at compounded interest, that's what that type of, just like any other investment, where people are happy to get right now. What we've been pulling out, people have been happy to get 4 or 5%. At one point, forestry, timber, pine timber was capable of producing 30 to 35%.
Annual rate of return.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
You're talking about something that people planted as nest eggs, and that's been jerked out from under them. It's not saying you can't sell it. It's saying that it's not worth what it once was. Now, of course, there's other ways that you can approach that, and there's a lot of things that play in the world of making money. Pole production and wildlife leases and enhancements to the property from a value standpoint and from a recreational standpoint. All those play in, but pure old-fashioned timber production, green money in your bank account, it doesn't pay what it used to. Mm-hmm. And everybody knows that, but you still have a lot of stumpage on the ground that we have to work through to get to the point where we're able to hopefully get back to where we were. Mm-hmm. It's all related to housing markets and things like that. Somewhat in the furniture market, but primarily we're housing market driven. And pine saw timber isn't bringing what it did, and we're not building houses, and we don't have the mills, and et cetera, et cetera. All of it plays in to give the landowner a lot less stumpage value than he used to get. Depends on where you're at in the state. If you're in the south half of the state, you're gonna be able to make more money than you are in the north half. If you're on the east side of the state, you're probably gonna make more money than you will on the west side of the state. And I'm in the northwest, right? So all that plays in, and it's just it's there, and it's still got value. It's just not what it was, and so you have a hesitancy. People are short term, goal oriented, and they see the fact that they can't sell their timber, or they have to wait to sell their timber, or they have trouble selling their timber. If they have small acreages, they may not be able to sell their timber, and you get this hesitancy to go back and plant anything after they perform a harvest cut. They clear cut it in the end, and it grows back in a jungle that doesn't necessarily have a lot of value from that standpoint either. So it's kind of a vicious circle. But anyway, you go back to looking at that thin to final harvest, or first thin to final harvest window of time. There used to be a pretty commonly applied second thin, even third thins in some cases. And I'm not saying that you don't see those rarely. Now they are becoming very, very, very uncommon. What I see a lot of, and I'm in the region where you're probably going to have the biggest wildlife management push from landowners, because I have the Delta, right? Mm-hmm. The biggest wildlife management, not a lot of pine in the Delta, but I also work the rim. Not a lot of push for pure timber management anymore. If you go back not that far back into the past, there was a pretty substantial portion of the state that's why you put trees in the ground, or that's why you managed. I don't see that much anymore. I'm not saying that there's not people out there that still do that, because there are. And we're not talking about industry. We're talking about those private landowners. At least in the top two, you're going to see wildlife. You're going to see improvements needed for wildlife. That's what it was during the heck. My 40 acres that I own, you know what? I'm a forester, and I'm going to tell you this. I think about it as a hunting property. Pure and simple. Mm-hmm. That's just the way it is, and that's very, very, very prevalent in the Delta. So I sell timber management through the guise of, you're improving your wildlife habitat. And there's some trade-offs. You're not going to optimize timber production, and you're not going to optimize wildlife habitat. But there's a lot of middle ground. Right. There's different shades of it. And you can go heavier to one or heavier to the other. But in my region especially, like I said, the northwest 20 counties over there, that is the biggest push in the forestry world. So one of the things that we've lost from a silvicultural standpoint, for all practical purposes, are those second and third thins. At least in that region, there are a few people that still do it, but they're taking hits on the economic side, and they want to do that type of treatment. But Like I said, we'll throw just a standard answer, and there's always, there's a range, but a standard answer was you did your first thin somewhere around age 15. You came back 5 or 6 years later, you did another thin, at 20, 22, somewhere in that range for your second thin, and you may get a third one in your final harvest. What I see a lot of now is in fairness, most people can't get their stand thin by age 15 or 16, so they're going into that 18, 20 year range before they do a first thin, and they just thin the heck out of it. They thin it down to 50 or 60 feet of basal area.
We'll define that in a moment.
We'll define that in a minute. But they thin it down a lot more than we would have done historically, where we would go into the 80 to 90 basal area range. And by doing that, they can eliminate having to come back and do a second thin. And they're also getting more bang for their buck as far as improving wildlife habitats. It's one of those places where that rivalry between wildlife and forestry kind of comes together. There's a few areas in the age of across the age and the period of growing a stand of trees where we do that, and that's one that I'm seeing becoming more and more and more prevalent over, at least in that region.
And what might be your span of time? So if you're only going to be able to get that one thinning at year 18, 19, 20, would the final harvest be 5 to 10 years later?
Typically 30 to 35 years in a rotation is what you expect in pines, silviculture. Now that's loblolly. You get into the longleaf world, that changes. Shortleaf, which very, 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 very few people plant, you could look at 40, 45 years probably on a rotation. It's just a slower growing species. Longleaf, all bets are off. It totally depends on what they're doing with their management. But and then we're not going to get into some of the others. But with loblolly, 30, 35 years, 30 being on the short end. Industry can do it in 26, 27, but they're pushing things and they're spending money out of accounts that the average landowner ain't going to have. 30, 35 years, most landowners are going to count on putting it on the ground and regenerating that stand. And then, dependent upon how you're going to regenerate it, you have options there. You can go back with the natural, like we talked about, leaving seed trees, so a few trees to the acre, or and getting wind dissemination of the seed and moving that way. Or you can cut every tree on the acre and set aside some of the money that comes in from that harvest and regenerating your stand with whatever planting stock you so choose, and then you start the cycle all over. When you move into hardwoods, it's a whole totally different world.
That's another podcast.
There you go. It'll be another podcast. But
so Brady, with the system you just mentioned, and clarify something for me too, with the cost of these improved trees, genetics, etc. You've got a much wider spacing, less trees per acre are planted. When do you see canopy closure in that context versus 15 years ago? Or are the trees growing so much faster, they're closing about the same time?
Good point. I know where you're going with that, because you're always thinking about wildlife, right?
Well, yeah.
You won't get canopy closure quite as fast as you would have. Well, nowhere near as fast as in a natural stand, but not quite as fast as you would have at the 680 or 780 trees per acre density. But those trees are growing faster, right? So you're going to get that closure. So most of those stands by 5 or 6 years, you're going to have, even on those wider spaces, you're going to start getting into crown closure. Definitely by age 8, you're going to have crown closure, and most of them it comes on a little quicker than that.
So you're still going to have a decade or so with diminished sunlight hitting the ground and forage production.
Yeah, absolutely. That's every stand.
Yeah.
It's just a shorter period in pines. But that's every stand.
I was just wondering if in this day and age you might have a longer window up front, and then if you're coming in for that more severe thinning at 18, 19, 20, and then you ride that out to year 30 or more, you almost are pushing where you've got half the life of the stand.
Yeah.
You're growing food.
Yeah, and I think depending on there's some spacing arrangements, without calling out any names or anything, there's some spacing arrangements that people use, like one very prominent group that I can think I've used a 5 by 20 spacing, so 5 feet inside the rows and 20 foot between the rows, and in a situation like that, you got open ground in between for a long time. And I mean, there's lots of things, and a lot of it always goes back to what your goals are. Goals as a landowner, which whether you're wildlife or forestry, that's at the core. That's what you're supposed to be trying to provide, and whatever that landowner prioritizes is where your recommendations and your pushing. I guess they're not necessarily pushing. You're guiding them into to hopefully to get their objectives met. That's where you start designing those plantings and what they put on the ground and that kind of thing. And I mean, if you really get into the genetics of it, there are different families in the various stock types, especially in the varietal world, the clonal forestry, where there are different families that have different branching angles, to where you have tighter, more compact crowns versus crowns that have a limb structure that lies flatter, and people go, well, why on earth would you design something wood quality? You think about a branch that comes out at a 30 or a 45. How long is it going to take that knot? As that branch basically self prunes over time. How long is it going to take for it to grow out? That tree to grow out and cover that knot versus something that's just truly flat. So that branching angle is very important from a qualitative standpoint, and that you get clear wood quicker. But now that costs you, right? Once you get into the varietal world, you can spend a lot of money really quick on seedlings. Pines have always been cheap. They're still cheap. They're still way cheaper than hardwoods, but you can get into some very, very, very expensive plant stocks too, if you so choose.
So let me ask you, Brady, and I'm not saying this is just unique to you, but one thing I do think you have a really good feel for. This man kills 5+ deer a year. Oh, yeah. So he does a lot of venison acquisition every year for him and family. If someone were to come to you and they were, hey, I understand trade-offs. I know I'm giving up something to get something. And they kind of wanted to split it down the middle of, I want to get some financial return, but I'm willing to give up a little for wildlife habitat. When does it make the most sense to start customizing your pine management? Is it from the beginning with spacing, or does it come where we're going to space them accordingly to grow timber and let the pruning happen, et cetera, and then you thin more heavily at that first commercial thin? Is that where you typically see changes in a trajectory of the stand depending on your objectives?
I'm going to give you the answer that nobody likes. It depends.
Well, we say it all the time, and we know nobody likes it.
Nobody really likes that, but that's the truth. And a lot of that goes, it depends on how much more heavily do they want one side of that coin. If it's somebody that likes to have a little, as you put it, wildlife habitat, but they're still pretty concerned with making some money and sending little Johnny to college down the road, I'm going to say let's wait and thin it heavier towards the middle of the rotation, because it gives you a longer window of time to pick which trees you want to leave, which ones are going to be the higher performing trees. If it's somebody, let me add one other stipulation to that. It also depends on if they're using cost share money and things like that, because there's requirements through those programs that they may not be able to just plan things however they so choose. But you flip it over and you get into somebody that really doesn't give too much of a care about making money. They like to pay for what they're doing on the ground with the timber, and they don't really care about anything outside of that. They just don't want to spend much money on creating the habitat. I'm going to say do it from the beginning. Especially if they're fronting the bill for their seedlings and everything else. Set it up the way you want. You just leave.
And is that just with spacing, or with the type of seedling, or both?
Both, okay. Absolutely both. If you don't really care, you're probably not going to be planting MCPs. You're not going to be planting those $140, $150 per thousand seedlings. You're going to go with the $60 or $70 per thousand seedlings because you don't really care. And you're still going to have enough wood production out of those lower, quote unquote, lower quality or lower value or lower growth, whatever you want to call it, seedlings as the higher ones to be able to sell it. You're just not going to make as much money. It's not going to be the quality associated with it or the size. Plus, you're able to, like I said, from a prioritization standpoint, you're able to start leaving wider spaces between trees if you want. I'm not talking about just shooting lanes, but actual lanes for habitat manipulation as you move forward, whether it's burning or whether it's mowing. Not that you guys do much of that, but herbicidal work. You're able to mold that site a little more into your picture that you have in your head of where you want to go with it.
Okay.
So it depends.
It
depends.
It always does.
Yeah.
Our goal is to help you get to where you want to be.
Well, Brady, you've done a great job of sharing how you've referred to the give and take and as the maximizing economic returns from timber productivity, and then there's that other end for the promoting wildlife values. And I think many of our listeners are somewhere in the middle or maybe towards the wildlife side of things. When you mentioned earlier competing vegetation, foresters trying to minimize competing vegetation, from our point of view, that competing vegetation is things like deer forage, fawn escape cover. Those are things we actually want.
Sure.
And so there's a lot of, and I've worked with your predecessor, Andy Ezel, for many years in integrating and understanding how that forestry and wildlife works together. There are different time periods and methods, and Bronson's already got you to talk about the time periods. Some of the things that we used to promote, we have promoted and continue to promote as wildlife actions are actually traditional timber stand improvement things, like the mid-rotation and the some selective herbicide and y'all. Commercial companies don't do prescribed fire much anymore, and I get that. Liability, smoke management, personnel, but private landowners, and some may even say we push prescribed fire a little bit, and certainly our colleague that's down in Florida now kind of lives and doesn't breathe smoke, but
he's a pyromaniac.
Yeah. So prescribed fire is a great tool for us, and historically it was used in forestry, but not so much. I'm rambling here. I'm almost talk about some of the tools that a forester would like to use that can also benefit wildlife, I guess.
Sure. I do want to back up just a second, though. Yeah. My statement about the competing vegetation was for site preparation. So that is in that finite moment. Yes, we want pine trees and dirt. After that, we enter into other. I'm fine with vegetation after that, and it's about not with pines. You think about pines; they need 95% light. You have to be able to. It has to have light, full sunlight, for that seedling to start growing. So long as it isn't covered up with vegetation, after that, it's really not a lot of benefit. So when I say that, I'm not talking about all the way through the rotation. I want to get that one out there.
Yep.
Once you get down the road, sure, some of the the QVM work, the quality vegetation management work that I think you were really heavy involved with that. Mm-hmm. The BASF developed some of that type of work, and you still those where it's a rotation of burn, herbicide and then selective herbicide and then burning on a rotation after you get that vegetative complex to the point that it's beneficial to you as a wildlife manager. You still see some of that. You still see a lot of that really with certain people. So we definitely we like herbicides. I really like herbicides, but we definitely like herbicides in forestry. We use a lot of it. We don't use as much of it as they do in some of the other commodity groups that I'm not gonna go there. But it's very we use a lot of herbicide across the region, but it's one time and then maybe one other time throughout the rotation of a pine stand. So we're not using exorbitant amounts that you're going to hear some people say.
And then it costs money. You don't want to spray something that's more than what
absolutely costs
you need.
Money. And that kind of leads me into one. You say we almost no, you guys promote fire. Don't. I never met a wildlifer that didn't. And as a hardwood guy, you know, I got a few issues here and there with using fire. But you know, in pines, I say you burn them up if you want to. When it comes down to a cost efficacy standpoint, I think of fire as a wildlife tool, pure and simple. We did use a lot of it in forestry, and you still see a fair amount of it used in forestry, but that was before we had some of those herbicides. When it was really used, it was before we had a lot of those herbicides that are available to you now. And it comes down to it's flat out cheaper to use herbicides. Yeah. And I've had people argue that at short courses and workshops, and you just have to say, okay, you thin at age 15. We're going to throw numbers out there. You come back and you burn it. What does it cost you to burn? At age 16, you come back and you burn it. It's going to cost you. You know, you'll hear people, I can get it done for 10. You know, rule of thumb, it's going to cost you $25, $30 an acre.
That's
okay?
if you're hiring it out.
If you're hiring it out. Now, if you're in a cooperative or you burn it yourself, absolutely, you know, that cost is definitely reduced. And I know some people that do that type of burning, and the cost of fuel, that's what it costs them. But for you hiring it out to somebody, it's going to cost you, we'll throw $25 at age 16 and then age 19. And then age 21, and so forth and so on. And so you get that cumulative effect over time, where there are other benefits to it. I mean, I'm pro, but from a pure timber standpoint, it's cheaper to use herbicides.
Yeah.
But there are other benefits that come along with the fire use, and I like fire. I don't know that I'd say I'm a pyromaniac, but I like fire. I like lighting fire. I like being around fire when it's used. And you get that vegetative flush that everybody loves, and the wildlife guys love it even more than the forestry guys. But planting crews or something like that like it even more than you. But you have that tool that's there, and you do get some benefits from fire, fuel reduction, and I mean there's some other things that we could go into. But it is a good tool, and it does have some use in forestry, but it costs more. And it's all about making money with forestry. So I look at it as a wildlife tool, and I like it, but I look at it as a wildlife tool. Depending on where you're at, you can get into some scenarios where you're cooking a lot of the nitrogen off through the pine, the foliage. That usually isn't a problem with most of our pine stands, but you can in certain parts of the world. You can get into some fertility issues. That's very uncommon for most of Mississippi. It just boils down to it's an expense. Is what it is, you know.
And you've kind of touched on this, and I've certainly seen it in other professional foresters. Some sensitivity about how much herbicide is applied. I mean, that's an issue.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
From an environmental standpoint, and legal environmental stuff, and
ecological standpoint.
Yeah, and the cost of herbicides, it's cheaper than fire, but it's still a cost, and so industry doesn't want to put out a lot of herbicides for a lot of reasons.
Yeah,
I used to be back in around 2000. Andy Ezel and I did a major project with the timber companies because they were getting picketed by deer hunters that felt like the timber companies were essentially, when they harvested a stand and then came back with site prep, they destroyed the deer habitat.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of controversy, and so we had funding to look at different levels of intensity of herbicides. And surprisingly, this was done in the lower coastal plain, and we tried different levels of herbicide treatments, and from none up to quite a bit. And the industry said, well, we're not even using that much anymore, but we used to, and so we stuck it in there as a bookend. And I was really pleasantly surprised to see that a moderate amount of herbicides actually helped improve the habitat in that particular case in particular, because at lower coastal plain you had a lot of dense, waxy-leaved, low-quality
Yopon and gallberry.
Yeah, a lot of stuff that the deer wouldn't necessarily benefit from. And we talk a lot about seasonal mismatch in the southeast between the needs of the deer in late summer and lactation, late gestation, lactation, and antler growth, and those browse leaves can't provide that. Yeah. So we found by getting rid of some of that browse, you could open the space up, sunlight and water and nutrients for forbs, and forbs are, the highest quality forage class for deer. So herbicides are not bad. And then we talked about mid-rotation management and using selective herbicides at that point. Of course, you don't want to kill your pine trees, but you can come in and selectively remove some of that woody encroachment, that hardwood competition. And we want to do that such that we promote, don't kill the forbs and don't kill the selected browse species that maybe we can get away with not killing, and that are deer food and turkey food and things that are soft mass producers in particular. Okay, so I know we're supposed to be asking you the question, I'm going to be a little bit quiet here, but it's something I'm very...
Yeah. Well, it's herbicides have this... I just got back from MAIC, where, I sat at the, which is the Mississippi Agricultural Industry Council. And I go down and I do the weed science roundtable on the first day. So I'm in a room full of nothing but nozzle heads. There's nothing. There's a few administrators in there too that are there, but it's nothing but herbicide people. And so it's easy to lose. I don't want to say lose touch, but in reality, that's kind of what it is, and realize that people are scared. It's not a matter of just being cautious. There's people that are just absolutely terrified of herbicides. So it's easy to lose that, and being an extension, I'm reminded of that pretty constantly. So, I do have to back up, but it never ceases to amaze me how many people will just, absolutely go nuts when they see that helicopter over the top of a pine stand. They don't say anything about the crop duster over those row crops. Yeah. But by George, they see a helicopter over the top of a clear cut, they come out of the woodwork. It's really interesting. I don't know why there's that difference in perception, but it's there.
That is
absolutely there.
Yeah. A number of years ago, an industry person referred to that to me as the social license. The ag industry, they quote, get away with more herbicide application because it's okay to, people accept that you put herbicides on cropland. And you're happy when you drive down the road and all you see are soybeans or all you see are corn. And foresters might like to see only pine trees, but society doesn't want that. Yeah. That's that social license that foresters have to kind of pay differently than other groups. Absolutely. So at mid-rotation, you've got another opportunity. If there's hardwood encroachment, you come in and spray a selective herbicide. Now I'm going to put my editorial 2 cents in here. And you mentioned earlier about the QVM, and that's just a kind of a trademark term that one of the companies came up with. It's just a selective herbicide, imazapyr, which to me is like the ideal mid-rotation selective herbicide. I know that foresters nowadays, your traditional forester, and this is kind of a word of warning to our listeners, if you have someone come in and say, create me some wildlife-friendly herbicide applications, they might also add a second ingredient that is designed to get rid of a few other species that a forester might not like to have around. But as a wildlife biologist, I'm going to I like those
just
plant species.
Just going to triclopyr. Go on and see what you think.
I want the rubus.
Yeah.
I know foresters hate to cruise timber through rubus patches, but wildlife biologists, we love blackberries and some of the other species that the triclopyr kills as well that imazapyr won't. Yeah. And so just beware and talk to your forester and say, hey, I like my rubus, and don't kill it.
Sure, and and that's the beauty of the different herbicides. We don't have anywhere near the number of labeled products in forestry that you're going to have in ag or turf or some of those other commodities or specialties. But we can pretty well tailor. You're going to lose some species no matter what you use. It might be beneficial for, in this case, wildlife, but we do have the ability to tailor an application to at least push your stand in the direction you want it to go, your habitat in the direction you want to go, whether it's just removing a certain invasive species or whether it's removing a whole species complex. If you want grasses out of something, we can remove grasses and leave the broadleaves. I mean, there are ways that you can work around that. You don't just broad spectrum blanket a prescription and it meet every scenario. There are things we can do to tailor your application to your individual goals within reason.
So the forester just has to listen to those,
Sure.
the landowner, and what's important to them.
Sure.
Okay.
Landowner objectives.
Yep.
And it depends. Okay, Brady, I'm going to throw a softball to you, and I want you to knock it out of the park. Steve and I are very guilty of using the term basal area. We know what it means, but we fail to explain it. And so we see that it gets misunderstood. Basal area is not the same as tree canopy coverage or the amount of sunlight coming through. Can you walk through kind of a forester's textbook definition of what it is, and then how does it relate?
You really want a forester's textbook definition here? I mean,
An extension forester's definition.
Okay,
watered
okay.
down.
You know,
version.
0.005454 diameter squared, right?
Let's not go that far.
Basal area, and we're all guilty of the same thing. We throw it out there because as a forester, and you guys deal with basal area enough as wildlife folks. You know, if I say, Steve, you know, that pine stand was 180 basal area. What does it look like?
Holy smokes!
Closed out.
Okay,
Shade.
if I say Bronson, you know, he was running 30 basal area. What do you think?
I might hear some bob whites.
Yeah,
It's
there you
wide
go.
open.
It's a quail stand. So it's a term that we are a measure of density that we throw around because everybody knows what it means. So we run into the exact same issues with programming. It's simply a measure of density across a stand, and it's cross-sectional area at 4.5 feet. So think about it, and I think a guy that used to work for us, James Floyd, who's now the forestry instructor at Holmes Community College there in Grenada, he had probably the best definite, real, one-on-one, one person to one person instruction type of guidelines for basal area that I ever saw, and we actually turned it into a publication that's out there that you can look up on the MSU Extension website. He described basal area as just think about a bunch of straws across a site, and you're going out there and you're trying to count how many straws are there. Well, you know the diameter of that straw. You know how much area is in that straw. So if you pick up 100 of them, you know it's 100 times that particular straw's area. So if you're running 100 square feet of basal area, it's 100 square feet of wood at 4.5 feet off the ground. It's just purely a measure of density. Unless you can visualize it and see it on the ground, it's kind of hard to say that, something that goes over the air, but it's simply a measure of how thick a stand is. And the higher the number, the more dense. The lower the number, the less dense. And you can get into trouble where you just start throwing it out and not including other species too, because if you talk about a pine stand that has a lot of mid-story sweet gum, elm, red maple, all the normal suspects underneath that canopy of pine, and you throw out, that stand has 110 feet of basal area in it, probably doesn't tell the whole story. You probably have another 30 or 40 of the other stuff that's growing underneath it. So it's just purely a measure of how dense a stand is, and there's things like TPA, trees per acre, but it doesn't truly give you a realistic picture of what that density is, because it's not just numbers, but it's also how much wood is standing on the stump out there. I don't know that really gives you what you're looking for there, but
I'm going to ask you to generalize.
Sure.
And you can come right back with it depends, species, site, blah, blah, blah. And I know. But kind of like where you started, I wonder if we could safely, where 9 out of 10 times we're going to be, in the ballpark with this. What would kind of be the continuum? Let me throw you out what I think, and you correct me.
Okay.
I start to think when you get above 8 for pine trees, loblolly pine, when you get above 80, there's very little sun coming through the tree canopy hitting the ground.
I agree.
Some, I mean, you're going to see some stuff on the ground, but very little. Versus like with a 30, if you got down to a 30 basal area, that is probably going to elicit the thought of people think of a South Georgia quail property plant, you know, tree here, tree there, and it's wide open. It's like a few trees in a prairie. And then a lot of our targets, you mentioned this earlier, is a lot of times we're shooting for thinning to around 50 to 60 basal area. And that is where you're going to have probably, I don't know, maybe 30 to 40% canopy opening, sunlight coming through in that ballpark, give or take. And that's kind of a good trade-off, I think, so far. And what we saw, Steve, well, Brady, you and I looked at some of these data. It's been a while back, but with both that hardwood study as well as some of the pine work, is that at about 50 basal area, it's diminishing returns on the wildlife habitat part if you go lower. So you are going to get more and more open canopy and more sunlight, but you no longer have that one-to-one correspondence with there's more rubus, you know, there's more beggar's light. It's like 50 is kind of a pretty good threshold there, pretty good target. So I guess when you think somebody throws the number out, 30 basal area, think Bob White, wide open. 50, 60, think of what is our typical, that's a pretty good trade-off for some timber management, some deer and turkey habitat. You get above 80, you've pretty much lost your understory for food and cover.
And from I agree with those numbers. Those
ballpark,
are in the ballpark.
give or take.
And from a traditional forestry standpoint, they would go, basically your target by a lot of people was plus or minus 10 feet of basal area from site index. So if your site was a site index 80, and I'll tell you what site index is, so you smiling. From site index 80, your goal was 80, but you were happy if it was 70 or you were happy if it was 90. And that's where you saw those. And I mean, you get into sites where you were running really high site indices, 95, 100, 105 in Loblolly Pine, which are great sites. You were okay if you had 100 square feet of basal area on the ground. You get above that, and you start thinking about time to thin. We've gone from that in a 15-20-year period. We've gone from that to, we're pretty happy if we get it down to 50 or 60 in a lot of cases, because it takes that to get a logger to actually come and haul that first wood away for us. So it's maybe not by design, because we wanted to carry as much wood as we could on a given acre, but it may not have been by design, but it was by necessity. Which is fine, because you get a lot of other benefits out of those stands as well. So you go back to site index. Like I said, I realized as soon as I said the term, I saw you kind of smirk at me over there. Site index is another term that we're going to use a lot of in forestry. It's just the quality of the site. The higher the number, the better the site for growing whatever our species of choice is. So you're looking at site index being basically you go out and you take the general height of the dominant trees on the site from a crown class standpoint, the tallest trees on the site, and you figure out how tall they're supposed to be at some base age. Hardwoods, you use base age 50, pines use a base age 25. And so the taller the tree is, in theory, the higher quality the soils are on the site. So better soils, taller trees, higher site index. And it's capable. It's kind of a built-in check. A better soil, higher site index, the more capability it had for carrying more wood. So your targeted residual basal area went up. We're not there anymore. We're like I said, we're down into the realm of we really try to get somebody there, and we don't want to have to come back, because there's even less wood in that second thin that they're pulling off of a site. So
Brady,
we find it hard to begin with.
Excuse me, does that negate, and keep in mind when you answer this, Ian Munn listens to this podcast, does that negate some of the recommendations Ian and some co-authors had years ago with if you're on a higher site index, then follow traditional timber management practices, because those are the sites that are going to yield the most money. However, and let's assume you have a large property, and let's assume there's variation in site index. It may not vary if it does. But there is where you'd have greater flexibility to go with an even lower basal area, or even maybe take it out of timber production. Or maybe that's a spot you let it naturally regenerate. You're not losing as much money on the lower site index parts of the property. Is that still generally true, or has the market changed?
So you're trying to get me crossed up with Ian, aren't you? No, I think it still applies. However, yes, your higher site index sites are more capable of growing wood, and you're better served to try to maximize, if you're going to maximize wood production, to maximize it on those higher sites. Same thing applies in hardwoods. You're better served to try to maximize your wood production on those higher quality sites. However, things have changed somewhat too in that, and I'm not saying the recommendation isn't still valid and viable if you have the ability to get that work done. And the reality of it is, in a lot of situations, a logger isn't going to come in and only cut 20 or 30 basal area, and whatever that equates to in your trees, trees on a tonnage per acre basis. He's going to have to cut enough to make it worthwhile for him. So yes, economically, biologically, that may be viable, and it may be viable on the real world side of things too. But ecologically, economically, biologically, everything else, it may still be applicable. However, logistically, you have trouble accomplishing that goal if you can't get a logger to come in and cut it.
Gotcha.
It totally depends.
Yeah.
If you have 1,000-acre block of timber, that's a different story than if you have 50 acres too.
Mm-hmm.
So that always plays in, and it's getting harder and harder for people to work on those smaller acreages from a logging cost standpoint too. But that's topic for a whole other.
You've made my day here, Brady, saying that loggers have to thin really hard.
They do.
To make it worth their while. Now, I'm not happy that that's the case for them, but from a wildlife standpoint, if loggers and foresters are driving heavier cuts, then that's down to that sweet spot of 50 basal area, maybe even pushing to 40.
Well, I mean, you guys have seen the thins around the state. You know where I'm coming from with that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can say what you want. It's the reality.
It's
the reality of it is, you're seeing a lot heavier thins than you used to, and there's variables, but there's a lot of factors that go into that have driven that.
And another really important point to remind our listeners: you talked about a projected timber glut for 30 or maybe 40 years moving forward. So, private landowners sitting with, a 1,000-acre property is a large property.
Yeah.
What about somebody like 300 or 400 acres, and they've got half or 2/3 of that into some type of a pine plantation that's in the 15 to 20 year range, and they're having trouble getting it harvested, and maybe they bought that land for primarily wildlife values. What are they good to do?
Come up with an answer for us.
Nobel Prize waiting for someone.
There you go. It's still, like I said, it's still there. It still pays. Forestry does still pay off. It has your expectations for the same kind of revenues probably should go down. However, to date, there are counties where people, and you get into some political issues there, and I won't go there, but there are counties where it's incredibly tough for people to sell timber, period. There are regions where it's a lot harder for people to sell timber. I mean, like I said, the Northwest. If you're in, we'll throw out a county. If you're in Yalobusha County,
Northwest
Mississippi, which is in my region, it's very, very tough because there's just no local mills. I mean, there's one little one there in Grenada, but that's it. There's nowhere else for them to haul pulpwood. It's not, the saw timber is not a problem. We can cut saw timber. It's the getting that intermediate type stand into compliance, so to speak. Getting that pulpwood cut is where the problem comes in, and there's just nowhere for them to haul the wood. And for a logger, a logger picks up and he moves. It's going to cost him $2,000 $3,000, $5,000 of everything from downtime. I mean, he has overhead just like everybody else. And if he's got $1 million worth of equipment he's paying for on site, every day that he's not cutting is costing him. He's still having to keep his people paid. He's still having to pay that bank note. So for him to move, he's going to have to get permits. He's going to have the downtime and all the other things that play into that. It's going to cost him like I said, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 in a lot of cases to pick up and move from one land, just to move from one landowner to the other. And when he does that, I mean, they're businessmen too, right? They're putting food on the table. It costs them enough that if you have 30 acres, you're going to have a hard time selling him timber, unless you can tie in somebody that's immediately adjacent to you that's working on the property or something like that. For them to be able to pick up and move, they are cherry picking. I mean, there's so much wood on the stump. They're moving to those 100, 200, 300 acre tracts. I mean, or 1,000. I'd be really happy if they can work for 2 or 3 months without having to pick up and move, because it's lost money. Downtime is lost money. So when you get into that world and you're trying to not upset somebody that thinks their timber is worth more than it is now, it's very dicey. It's very difficult, and I mean, I can understand the emotions that are there on the landowner side, which is my primary client group that I work with, but also work with some with loggers, not much, and then a fair amount with foresters. And you're trying to satisfy all parties involved. It gets very difficult for a landowner. They realize that what's going on, but it gets hard for them to accept it. And I don't blame them. It gets very, very difficult to say, well, yes, you were promised, and I'm not going to throw out the number that used to be thrown out because I still hear it all the time. Your timber investment is going to appreciate at this amount per acre per year. Yep. And we're not there. We're operating on maybe a fifth of what that was, if you're lucky. And it's a very difficult system to work now, because the logger is going to have to make his money, or he's not going to be able to stay in business. The mill is going to make its money once the wood is delivered. The landowner is always going to be the one that I'm not going to say gets shafted, but he's going to have to take the hits. He's going to have to take the hits.
And if that landowner is truly primarily interested in wildlife values, and if they're not relying on the income to send John and Jane to college, is this an option even for that less than 100 acre property with maybe 30 acres of stand that they really need to thin? Is it possible to get say just come in and thin my timber and you can have it? You don't even have to pay me. Is that an option?
You say that with a question on your face. Sometimes not. I can think of, and again, I will not call any names here. I can think of 2 landowners in the last couple of years that, because of location, they literally could not give a logger the timber.
Wow.
First thin pines. Literally could not give away that first thin pine because of their location, where they're at in the state. Those are kind of rare, but they're out there. There's another county where it's maybe not wholesale, but it's not uncommon that I have seen landowners actually paying a unit price, so per acre, $20, $25 an acre, and the logger keeps the wood, just to be able to get the logger there. Now that's smaller properties, but they're actually paying. Forget revenue. They're actually paying somebody to come in and harvest that timber and take the timber free of charge. I can think of another individual this past year that wanted his stand thin. He's got a 225 acre property, 25, 27 acres, something like that, worth of first thin pine that was 19, 20 years old, somewhere in that range. So it needed thin. And I walked through the stand with him and I said, well, you're never going to get it cut unless you tie in with something else. And he tied in. The adjacent landowner was doing second thin. He actually one of the few that did get a second thin. He actually was doing a second thin in a pine stand and some thinning in a hardwood stand, and he tied in with that landowner. And the logger said, well, look, I tell you what I'll do. I will cut it for you if you pay for my fuel. As a favor, down the road, I want to be able to come and work your timber. If you'll call me and I make you a fair price, I won't right of first refusal, basically. If you pay for my fuel, I will come in and I will cut that timber. I will thin that stand for you, but I'm going to leave it on the ground. Kid you not, the logger could not make enough money from carrying that pulpwood to the mill. Part of it was haul distance. Part of it is just, it is what it is. Pulpwood just doesn't have a lot of value. He couldn't make enough money from hauling that timber to break even at the mill on that load of pulpwood. So he said, sure.
Even if he got it for free.
Even if he got it for free. Even if he were paid to cut it, he's still losing money by actually hauling it to the mill. So he fell in place and, sitting there rotting on site, and they have their fingers crossed and they're praying that it doesn't, catch on fire. But that's a rarity. I'm not saying that's the norm, but that is occurring in some small locations. Interestingly, that guy wants deer. That's the reason he's thinning. It's a wildlife improvement, and so he's willing to do that. He's willing to pay for the fuel and just have it failed and fell in place and let it go back to soil. Those are rare. But those are out there. They do exist. And once you get below 50-ish acres, 40 maybe on the low end, it's really tough unless you can tie in or unless you can sweeten the pot. And it's hard for a logger to be able to absorb the cost of moving to come and harvest your timber because he's in a first thin pine situation. He's just not able to make any money.
Well, for decades, we've talked about landowner cooperatives for deer management because the deer move around so much. This is new to me. You're talking about a landowner cooperative of landowners trying to get their timber harvested. And
actually, believe it or not, I've actually heard that thrown around a little bit. I've never seen it enacted other than a group of siblings. I forget, there's 4 or 5 brothers and I think 2 sisters. And that's what they did. They had the old family, 500, 600 acres, the old family place, and they waited. The ones that had a little bit older timber waited for the younger timber to catch up, and that's the way they did it. They thinned it all at once. So that's always a good option to tie in with somebody relatively close because you're going to have the ability to move that wood more readily than you would if you were trying to do it on your own, even with something 100 acres in size.
Yeah.
The more acreage that you're looking at harvesting or working, the more attractive it is to most loggers because they're able to stay there a lot longer. They're able to set up and operate instead of having to pick up and move, get road permits, get haul permits, go through all the process. It's just makes more sense from a business.
They got to be profitable.
Yep.
Or you're in trouble.
Yep. And I'll give my plug to John Al here. We can't operate without loggers, folks.
That's right.
That's an integral part of the equation. And they get a lot of bad press. A lot of it's undeserved. Some of it may be, but a lot of it's undeserved. We can't operate without them. That's the point where the wood, where the wood hits the ground. That's where it happens. And without loggers, it doesn't operate. And now, both wildlife side and forestry side, we don't operate without that.
Agreed.
That middle guy. So.
Well, Bronson, I know we're probably pushing the clock here.
We are.
This has been fantastic.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask one last quick question.
And I've got one more after that.
Okay.
We'll wrap it.
So you go ahead and go.
Okay. I'm sensing something philosophical from you, Steve.
Well, no, momentarily I forgot what my question was. But I remember it now if you want me to go ahead.
This kind of deviates from the topic, but real quick, Brady, because I know you could get the forest entomologist in here and talk for hours, but primary pest, and if someone sees what they think is a pest, like a pine beetle, what do they do? Who do they call? Where do they start?
Sure. Primary pest in pine settings is going to still be our good old buddy, the bark beetle. We do have southern pine beetle in the state, but we don't have the outbreaks that we used to. excluding the federal grounds. I mean, most folks are familiar with, at least out there peripherally, they're familiar with some of the issues that the Forest Service had on the national forest over the last few years. But from a private landowner standpoint, not a lot of issues with southern pine beetle. Part of that is because it was managed. We were cutting wood. We weren't letting it get into that older age class or dense stand conditions where we had a lot of issues. If we don't start cutting some wood, there are those of us that think that may come back to where we start having problems with southern pine beetle. Most of what you see out there right now, if you're looking at pine insect problems, is going to be Ips beetles. They're pine engraver beetles, 3 different primaries that are going to be problems there in the state. And at least historically, traditionally, according to the textbook, they don't necessarily hit just one tree here and there, but they don't usually go over 4 or 5 trees, little small groups. And they're hitting slash material, they're hitting twigs and branches and things like that in the upper bowl of the tree. However, we have seen that change. Drought and dense stand conditions and things like that. We've seen some beetle spots that look more like an SPB type infestation, where we see acre and a half spots, things like that. That's due to one of the Ips beetles. I can think of Clarksdale. I guess 2018, I think, is when they had a lot of problems up there. I went to a golf course, and there's 48 or 49 trees that were dying on them. No, it's 48 or 49 pine trees that they had on this golf course, and there's like 47 or 48 of them that were on their way out, and it was Ips. The whole delta was eaten up with Ips beetles that year for some reason. And so you see some of that. We have some other minor players, but that's the big one. Deodar weevil is one that kind of popped up a few years back, and you saw a lot of it. And the same exact reasons. We've got dense stands, but there are some others. But primarily,
once you got them, you just got to cut the trees, get them off the property.
Density, decrease density. And as far as who to call, who to contact for identification, who to contact for some solution, you can always go through the Forestry Commission. Those guys are busy, just like everybody else. They had some pretty serious cuts a few years ago, and most of those service foresters have 3 or 4 counties in a lot of cases. But you can contact those guys and gals and get somebody out there. You can contact your local extension agent. A lot of those are at least rudimentarily trained in insect ID. Some of them way more so than others. I can think of one in particular that I think he did a master's in it. He knows his stuff. It just depends, but at least they have an idea who to contact. You can contact your local extension forester. There's 4 of us that are out in the counties on a regional basis. You can take pictures and send in to the department. I mean, there's several different ways you can approach it. But if you have problems with it, we can look at it. We can figure it out for you. Anyway,
this timber glut, the market forces you've been talking about, it's really complex. Are these conditions found outside of Mississippi and the rest of the Southeast? And what about heading north from there?
In the South. Some states worse than others, but Mississippi seems to be hit. Of course, it's personal for me, but it seems to be hit a little harder than some of the other states. There's a lot of variables in that too, like lower logging force or smaller logging force, I guess you should say. Decreased number of mills, things like that. New mills that are coming in, and we're starting to have some mills that are coming in. I think we've had 6 either reopenings or new mill announcements in the last 2 years in the state. So you're starting to see some industry come back, but we're still we're operating on about a third of what we were 25 years ago. Because of those different factors, you're seeing that stumpage, the increase in the amount of wood on the stump. I can think Arkansas has some issues, Alabama has some issues, and you hear from other foresters. But Mississippi has always, since the early 1900s, you can't say always, since the early 1900s, we've been one of the major producers nationally for wood, because we can do it fast and we can do it cheap. and we have a lot of wood on the stump, just pure and simple. But it regionally, yes, but Mississippi seems, at least to me, seems to be a little worse off than some of the other states.
Okay. So as we wrap up, if you had to, from your knowledge of forestry, knowing that our listeners are primarily interested in wildlife values, could you kind of 2 or 3 points that you'd want them to keep, to remember the most from your time with us?
Sure. And I'd say the exact same thing in hardwoods. It's all about the light. Once you move over into managing for wildlife, you have to have light on the ground, pure and simple. How you get it, that's up to you. Whether it's thinning, whether it's planting, adjusting your spacing, whether it's thinning heavily, it's all about the light. Light equals vegetation. Vegetation equals, if it's the right type of vegetation, equals habitat. Habitat equals whatever your target species is. That's from me. That's one of the biggest things that I would say. You have to have vegetation. You have to have light to get vegetation. Outside of that, we're not paying what we used to from a forestry standpoint. That's fine. Hang in there. If you look at it, it's cyclic. You go back as far back as we've kept records. There were peaks, there were ebbs, there were troughs and peaks where we would cycle in, and industry would follow, and people would make a lot more money on timber, and then it would fall down and the bottom would fall out, and everybody tried to retro convert into something else. It's happened at least since the 20s. It'll come back. We just happen to have troughed and then plateaued for a few years here. It'll come back. I fully believe that. I think we're going to have to determine what to do with pulp. One way or another, we're going to either have to eliminate that or reduce it to a certain certain amount. We're going to have to reduce cutting or having to deal with those pulpwood-sized trees, or we're going to have another end product come in, one or the other. But I think we'll have to learn how to deal with pulpwood. But outside of that, the saw timber, it'll come back. I fully believe that. The econ people will tell you that too. For once, we agree. I think we're on the same page there.
Okay, great.
Steve, if you remember when we had John Grucci on here a few months ago when he was talking about private lands biologists with MBWF&P, and we asked him about top 10 habitat mistakes. I think that was kind of the theme or title of it. And one of those was working with landowners that did not have a forest management plan. So it's and we always say too with advising students, you need to take a silviculture class.
Yeah.
Managing habitat in the Southeast is managing trees, so you need to know that stuff. So Brady, thank you for your time and educating us and hopefully helping out our audience. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Appreciate the opportunity.
Fantastic. We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowed financial support of our efforts.
We also thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. If you have questions or suggestions, please log on to msudeerlab.com and click on the Deer University tab.